The spade struck stone with a dull clink that echoed in the thin autumn air. It was a sound Ilara was learning to hate. It meant another hour of prying, of levering with a greenwood pole until her shoulders screamed and her small hands were raw. She was 11 years old, and she was digging her own grave. At least, that was what they said in the village. A wet nose nudged her bleeding knuckles. Fen, her wolf-dog companion, whined softly, his intelligent yellow eyes fixed on her face. He was all she had left of her family, a silent, fur-covered shadow who had followed her into exile without question. He had been a pup when her parents died the winter before, and now he was nearly full-grown, his loyalty a solid, warm presence in the vast, cold emptiness of the barrens. Ilara scratched behind his ears, the rough fur a familiar comfort. "It's not a grave, Fen," she whispered, her voice a small thing against the sighing of the wind through the sparse pines. "It's a home." She reset her grip on the worn hickory handle of her father's spade and attacked the soil again, this time a few inches to the left. Loam, then clay. Better. Each shovelful was a victory. She was already 4 feet down, the pit a rough rectangle 12 feet by 16. The pile of excavated earth was growing into a small hillock beside it, a testament to 3 weeks of relentless, solitary labor. The memory of the council meeting was a fresh burn. Councilman Valerius, his face stern and unforgiving, pointing a thick finger at her. Hysteria. Dangerous lies from a child who ought to know her place. He had held up her father's journal, its leather cover cracked and stained, as if it were a diseased thing. "These are not the words of a scholar. They are the ramblings of a madman, and she has inherited his madness." She had tried to explain. She had used their words, the ones they had taught her. She spoke of the shifting patterns in the migratory birds, the early insect dormancy, the strange, deep taste of the well water. She spoke of the ice cores her father had studied and the 100-year cycles he had charted. A great freeze was coming, he had written. Not a hard winter, but a season of absolute killing cold, the likes of which had not been seen in 5 generations. They called her a liar, an orphan seeking attention, spreading fear. The exile was their solution. Not to the wilderness, they weren't that cruel, but to the barrens, a strip of unclaimed land a half-mile from the village edge, close enough to be watched, far enough to be forgotten. She was to live there until she recanted her fanciful stories. She would never recant. Her parents' knowledge was the only thing they hadn't taken from her. A voice, rough as bark, startled her. "Still at it, then?" Bren, the village's oldest woodcutter, stood at the edge of her pit, leaning on his axe. His face was a road map of wrinkles, his eyes narrowed with a mixture of pity and scorn. He had been one of the loudest voices against her. "Wait until the first real snow," he'd scoffed in the town square. "That'll teach her the difference between stories and survival." Ilara didn't stop digging. She just drove the spade into the earth. Thump. "You'll bury yourself alive, girl," Bren said, shaking his head. "A hole in the ground is a cold tomb. The frost will creep down and take you in your sleep. Everyone knows you build up, not down. You need your fire's smoke to have a place to go." "I have a plan," she said, her voice flat. It was her standard reply. She didn't have the energy for arguments. Her proof would be in the doing. "A plan," he chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "The girl has a plan. Listen, child, I've seen 70 winters in this valley. I know the cold. This is foolishness. That tent of yours won't last another month." He gestured with his axe toward the flimsy canvas shelter she slept in, already patched in 3 places. "It doesn't have to," Ilara said, finally pausing to push a stray strand of dark hair from her eyes. She looked up at him, her gaze direct and unwavering. "This will be done." Bren stared at her for a long moment, his certainty flickering for just an instant in the face of her quiet resolve. Then he shook his head again, the moment gone. "Suit yourself. Don't come crying to us when the wolves are sniffing at your frozen toes." He turned and trudged away, his heavy boots crushing the dry autumn grass. Ilara watched him go, then looked down at her hands. The blisters had broken and bled, and were now forming thick calluses. Her back ached constantly, a low, persistent fire. But every scoop of dirt was an act of faith. Her father's journal was her scripture. He had written of the ancient peoples, the ones who understood the earth not as a surface to live upon, but as a blanket to live within. "The ground has a deep warmth," he wrote, "a constant heat that the air can never steal. The mistake is in fighting the cold. The secret is to go where the cold cannot follow." Her design was more than a simple pit. It would have a long, angled entryway, a cold sink, her father had called it, a deeper pit just inside the door to trap the heavy, cold air and prevent it from entering the main living space. The roof would be timbered, covered with oilcloth scavenged from their old shed, and then buried under a thick layer of the excavated earth and sod. A small, carefully designed chimney of stone and clay would draw smoke from a central fire pit, its flue angled to prevent downdrafts. It was a living, breathing thing, a structure born of observation and respect for the physics of heat and cold. It was her inheritance. Finn rested his head on the edge of the pit, his tail giving a slow, rhythmic thump against the ground. He believed her. That was enough. She picked up the spade. There was so much more to do, and the days were getting shorter. The wind carried a new edge now, a sharp, crystalline bite that promised an end to autumn. The freeze was coming. She could feel it in her bones. She had to be ready. Weeks turned into a month, then 2. The pit deepened to 8 feet. Ilara's world shrank to the rhythmic scrape of shovel on earth, the groan of wood, the burn of her muscles. She learned the language of the soil, the soft give of the loam, the stubborn grit of the clay, the sharp refusal of bedrock. She worked from the first pale light of dawn until her arms would no longer lift the spade, eating handfuls of dried berries and smoked fish from the stores she'd managed to hide before her exile. The hardest part was the timber. The barrens were named for their lack of substantial trees. She had to venture further, into the woods that bordered the village lands, a place she was technically forbidden to go. With a small hatchet and a simple saw, she felled young pines and aspens, none thicker than her thigh. It was grueling work. Each tree took an hour to bring down, another to limb. Then came the hauling. She'd tie a rope to one end and pull, her small body straining, her boots slipping on the pine needles. Fen helped, grabbing the rope in his teeth and pulling alongside her, his powerful muscles bunching. Together, they would drag the logs back to her construction site, one painstaking trip at a time. She needed 30 main beams for the roof, and twice as many smaller poles for the support lattice. 30. The number felt impossibly large. Her work did not go unnoticed. One afternoon, Councilman Valerius himself rode out on his handsome gray mare. He sat astride the horse, looking down at her and the sprawling chaos of her labor. He did not dismount. "This is an unsanctioned structure, Ilara," he said, his voice carrying the easy authority of a man who had never been questioned. "An eyesore and a danger. What do you intend to do when the walls of this hole collapse in the first rain?" "They won't," Ilara said, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of a dirty hand. She was lashing two of the main beams together to form an A-frame for the roof's center ridge. "They won't," Valerius repeated with a condescending smile. "The certainty of youth. You are a danger to yourself. This obsession with your father's fantasies is unhealthy." Ilara looked at the carefully notched joints she had just cut, the way they fit together with satisfying precision. It wasn't fantasy. It was geometry. It was physics. "It will hold," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "When you have had enough of this foolishness," Valerius said, gathering his reins, "you may petition the council. A public apology for the fear you've spread would go a long way." He turned his horse and cantered away, leaving behind the scent of leather and superiority. Not everyone was so cruel. Mara, the baker's wife, sometimes left a small bundle at the edge of the barrens, a warm loaf of bread, a piece of cheese, a small pot of stew. She was a kind woman who had been friends with Ilara's mother. She came one evening as the sun was setting, casting long, skeletal shadows from the pines. Ilara was wrestling a heavy roof beam into place, her feet braced against the pit wall. "Oh, child," Mara sighed, her hands twisting in her apron. "Look at you. You're thin as a rail. This is no life." "I'm all right, Mara," Ilara grunted, giving the beam one last heave. It settled into its notch with a solid thud. "Come back to the village," Mara pleaded, her eyes wet. "Just tell them you were mistaken. Tell them you were grieving and confused. They will forgive you." Valerius is a hard man, but the others, they don't want to see a child suffer. Ilara slid down the earthen wall into her pit. She looked up at the lattice of timbers taking shape above her, a skeleton waiting for skin. It was more real to her than the village, more honest. "I wasn't mistaken," she said softly. "And this isn't suffering. This is work." Mara looked from Ilara's determined face to the deep, shadowed hole, and for a moment she seemed to see not a grave, but the beginnings of a fortress. A flicker of something, not understanding, but a deep, unsettled worry crossed her features. She left the offered bread on a stump and departed without another word. By the time the first snow flurries danced in the air, the main structure was complete. The 30 beams formed a sturdy, interlocking roof. Over this, she stretched the heavy oilcloth she had salvaged, tacking it down with leather strips and iron nails her father had left in his toolbox. Then came the final, most important layer. For days, she and Finn worked to move the great pile of excavated earth onto the roof, packing it down, shaping it. The structure began to disappear, transforming from a wooden skeleton into a low, rounded hill. She saved the topsoil, rich with grass seeds and roots, for last, patting it into place like a blanket. Come spring, her home would be a meadow. Inside, it was a dark, earthy-smelling cavern. She built the cold sink, a 4-foot-deep pit just inside the entrance tunnel. She laid a floor of flat stones around the central fire pit and built a sleeping platform against the far wall, raising it a foot off the ground. The most difficult part was the chimney. She used flat stones and a sticky mortar of clay and grass, building it up through a hole in the roof timbers. It was slow, frustrating work. Her first 2 attempts collapsed. The third held. The day she finished, a profound quiet fell over the barrens. The wind had died. The sky was a strange, bruised purple, heavy and low. Finn paced restlessly, his ears flat, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Ilara stood outside her mound, a small, dirt-streaked girl next to a hill of her own making. The air was preternaturally still, and so cold it felt thin in her lungs. The birds were gone. All of them. She gathered the last of her firewood, stacking it inside the long entryway. She brought in her meager supplies, the smoked fish, the dried berries, her parents' books, a tinderbox, and 2 buckets of clean water. Then she and Fen went inside. She had fashioned a door from 3 layers of cured deer hide stuffed with dried grass for insulation, and another, heavier wooden one for the outer entrance. She secured them both. The darkness inside was absolute. Ilara felt her way to the fire pit, her hands brushing against the cool, damp earth of the walls. She struck her flint. A spark caught in the tinder. With gentle breaths, she coaxed it to life, adding small twigs, then larger sticks. A small flame flickered, then grew, casting a warm, dancing light across the interior. The smoke, thin at first, found the flue and began to draw, a steady, upward stream. The stone-lined pit radiated a gentle heat. Fen curled up on the sleeping platform, resting his head on his paws with a deep sigh. The restless energy had left him. Here, he was calm. Ilara sat by the fire, watching the flames. Outside, the world had vanished. There was only the muffled sound of the rising wind, a low moan that seemed to come from the earth itself. It was the sound of the great freeze arriving. But here, in the dark and the warmth, Ilara was not afraid. She was home. The first blizzard was a test. It raged for 3 days, a white fury that buried the landscape. Inside the Earth Lodge, life achieved a quiet rhythm. The wind howled over the mound, but the sound was distant, muted, as if happening in another world. The temperature in the main chamber held steady. Ilara could sit comfortably in her tunic, the fire's warmth reflecting off the earthen walls. The cold air flowing down the entrance tunnel fell neatly into the cold sink, a silent, invisible waterfall, leaving the living space undisturbed. Her father's theories were not theories, they were truth. She ate sparingly, read his journals by firelight, and slept more soundly than she had in months, with Fen a warm weight at her back. When the storm broke, she pushed open the heavy outer door to a world transformed. The snow was piled in massive drifts, sculpting the barrens into a landscape of alien white curves. The top of her chimney pipe was the only part of her home visible. She had to tunnel her way out. The air that met her was colder than anything she had ever experienced. It was not just cold, it was actively hostile. It felt sharp, crystalline, a physical presence that stole the breath and burned the skin. When she spat, it froze in a tiny bead before it hit the snow. Back in the village, panic was setting in. The blizzard had been the herald of a deeper, more terrifying cold. The temperature, measured by the old mercury thermometer outside the council hall, had dropped to 40 degrees below zero, and then the mercury had frozen solid in its bulb. It kept dropping. The oldest residents could remember winters of 20 below, even 30. But this was different. This was a cold that broke things. Great oaks in the town square split apart with cracks like rifle shots. The river, which had never been known to freeze more than a foot deep, was now a solid block of ice to its very bed. Windows in the sturdiest houses shattered, the glass contracting until it exploded inward. The livestock in the barns, even those packed with straw, were freezing to death where they stood. The villagers huddled in their homes, burning through their woodpiles at an alarming rate. But the cold was relentless. It seeped through the thickest stone walls, through the chinking in the log cabins. It found every crack, every seam. Frost grew not just on the windows but on the interior walls, thick and feathery, creeping across the rooms like a living thing. Food stores froze solid in the pantries. Water barrels turned to solid ice. People were getting sick. A deep, rattling cough started to spread, a sickness of the lungs that flourished in the frigid, stagnant air of the sealed houses. The first to die was an infant, then 2 of the elders. Fear, colder than any wind, began to grip the heart of the village. Bren the woodcutter was one of the first to truly understand their predicament. His cabin, which he had built himself and prided himself on for its sturdiness, was failing. Despite a roaring fire that consumed a quarter of his winter wood in a single week, the corners of his room were rimed with ice. He could see his breath in every part of the house except the 2 feet directly in front of the hearth. He was 70 years old, and for the first time in his life, he was afraid of the winter. He thought of the girl, the liar, the fool digging her own grave. He thought of her quiet, stubborn certainty. It will hold. It was the craziest thing he'd ever seen. But his house, the pinnacle of a lifetime of conventional wisdom, was becoming a tomb. He bundled himself in every layer of wool and fur he owned and stepped outside. The cold was a physical blow. His beard froze instantly. He trudged through the deep, squeaking snow, his destination the one place he had sworn he would never go: the Barrens. It took him nearly an hour to cover the half-mile, a journey that normally took 10 minutes. He was gasping for air, his lungs burning, his skin numb. He almost missed it. The landscape was so uniform, so buried, but then he saw it. A thin, almost invisible plume of gray smoke rising from a small pipe sticking out of a snowdrift. It was a sign of life in a world that felt entirely dead. He stumbled toward it, falling into the deep snow that covered the entrance tunnel. He clawed his way to the heavy wooden door, his hands too numb to knock properly. He beat against it with his fist, a weak, desperate drumming. "Girl," he croaked, his voice cracking. "Ilara!" The door scraped open a few inches. A sliver of warm, fire-lit air washed over his face, smelling of wood smoke and earth. Ilara looked out, her face framed by the dark fur of her hood. Fen stood beside her, a low growl in his throat. Bren fell to his knees. He was exhausted, frostbitten, and utterly defeated. "The girl," he whispered, the words catching in his frozen throat. "The liar. She was right." He collapsed into the snow of the entryway. Ilara didn't hesitate. She and Finn dragged him inside, through the hide inner door and into the main chamber. The warmth was shocking, a blissful wave that made Bren's frozen flesh ache with 1,000 needles of returning life. She settled him by the fire, removed his frozen boots and gloves, and wrapped him in a thick wool blanket. She gave him a cup of warm, weak tea brewed from pine needles. She didn't say a word. No, "I told you so." No recrimination. Just quiet, efficient care. He was the first. 2 days later, a larger group arrived, led by Mara. Her husband and 2 small children were with her, their faces pale and pinched with cold. Mara's youngest was coughing, the same deep, rattling cough that had taken the others. "Ilara," Mara said, her voice trembling as she stood in the entrance. "Our house. The walls are ice. We can't keep the children warm. Please." Ilara simply nodded and gestured them inside. She made a place for them on the far side of the fire pit, sharing her blankets, her food. The space grew crowded, but it also grew warmer, the combined body heat adding to the fire's glow. The last to arrive was Councilman Valerius. He came alone, his fine fur cloak tattered, his face gray with humility and desperation. His grand stone house, the warmest in the village, had become a mausoleum of ice. His wife had taken ill, and his servants had fled. He stood in the entrance to the Earth Lodge, the man who had exiled her, now a beggar at her door. "My wife is sick," he said, his voice stripped of all its former arrogance. We have nowhere else to go." Ilara looked at him, her expression unreadable in the firelight. Then she looked past him, into the frigid twilight. "Bring her," she said. The Earth Lodge became an ark. By the end of the week, nearly 20 people were living in the space she had built for two. They huddled together in the warm, dim light, a community of survivors. They shared the dwindling food, listened to the ceaseless howl of the wind outside, and watched Ilara with a new and profound respect. She was their keeper. She rationed the food, tended the sick with herbal remedies her mother had taught her, and kept the fire burning, the heart of their new world. One evening, as the wind screamed its loudest and the timbers of the roof creaked under a fresh load of snow, Valerius sat by the fire, watching Ilara check the lashings on the inner door. "We were wrong," he said, his voice quiet, meant only for her. "About everything. Your father, you. We were fools, proud, arrogant fools." Ilara finished her task and came to sit across the fire from him. She simply met his gaze and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was all the absolution he would get, and more than he deserved. In the warm, crowded silence of the shelter, it was enough. The freeze had broken the village, but it had forged something new in its place, down in the dark, in the home Ilara had built. The thaw, when it finally came, was as dangerous as the freeze. For 6 weeks, the merciless cold had held the valley in its grip. Then, one morning, the wind shifted. A Chinook wind, warm and moist, swept down from the mountains. The temperature rose 40 degrees in a single day. The world began to weep. The snowpack, feet deep and dense as ice, turned to slush. The river, frozen solid, began to groan and crack, the sound of a waking giant. Water, trapped for weeks, poured from the hillsides. The village, situated in the valley floor, was in the direct path of the deluge. The survivors, emerging from Ilara's shelter, could only watch in horror. Their frozen, brittle homes were now battered by torrents of meltwater and great grinding chunks of river ice. Walls that had withstood the cold were smashed by the flood. What the freeze had not destroyed, the thaw washed away. By the time the floodwaters receded, the village was gone. A few stone chimneys stood like lonely sentinels in a sea of mud and debris. The work of generations had been erased in a season. Their home was now the hill in the barrens. Ilara's Earth Lodge, its rounded shape and deep-set foundation, had shed the water as easily as it had shed the snow. It remained. Soon villagers were gathered around the fire in the evenings, not for warmth, but for knowledge. Bryn, who could read, would slowly decipher Ilara's father's spidery script, his rough voice explaining the principles of thermal mass, of cold sinks, of using the earth itself as insulation. They learned that their ancestors had built upwards out of pride, to dominate the landscape, and in doing so had forgotten the simple, powerful wisdom of shelter. They did not rebuild the old village. Instead, under Ilara's quiet guidance, they began to build a new one, a community of earth lodges spread across the gentle slopes of the valley, safe from the floodplain. Bryn, with his lifetime of woodworking skills, became the master of timber framing, teaching the others how to notch and join the beams for maximum strength. Valerius, using his family's wealth, organized the procurement of tools and supplies from other towns, his shame channeled into a fierce determination to see his people safe. Ilara did not lead in the way Valerius had, with speeches and commands. She led by doing. She showed them how to site a dwelling to catch the winter sun, how to mix clay and grass for a perfect mortar, how to lay the sod on a roof so the roots would interlock and form a living shield. She was patient, her words few but precise. She had become a teacher. The outcast was now the cornerstone. Years passed. The valley healed. The raw, muddy slopes where the new lodges were built grew green with grass. The community became known for its strange, beautiful dwellings that looked like rolling, smoke-breathing hills. They were warmer in winter and cooler in summer than any timber frame house, and they were safe. When the hard winters came, as they always did, the people were no longer afraid. They had learned the earth's lesson. Ilara grew from a girl into a young woman. The harshness of her childhood had left its mark. She remained quiet, observant, and slow to trust. She never moved from her original shelter, even as larger, more comfortable ones were built. It was her place, her history. Fen grew old beside her, his muzzle turning gray, his steps becoming slower. He was a constant, living link to the time before, a silent witness to all she had endured and accomplished. The people of the valley revered him almost as much as they did her. He was the companion who had never doubted. The seasons turned, 20 times, then 30. The raw settlement grew into a thriving, resilient town. The story of the Great Freeze and the girl who saved them became a founding myth, told to children on winter nights as they sat warm and secure in their earthen homes. Ilara, now a woman in her 40s with streaks of silver in her dark hair, was the village matriarch, the keeper of knowledge. She never married, never had children of her own, yet every child in the valley was hers to teach. One mild autumn evening, Fen did not eat his dinner. He was very old, his great heart finally slowing. He lay by the fire in the original shelter, his breathing shallow. Ilara sat with him, her hand resting on his flank, feeling the gentle rise and fall. She had known this day was coming. He looked up at her, his yellow eyes, though clouded with age, still full of a deep and unwavering love. He rested his head in her lap, gave a soft sigh, and was still. His breathing grew shallow, a soft tide going out. Then it stopped. The silence he left behind was immense, a hollow space that even the crackling fire could not fill. Ilara sat with him through the night. At dawn, she carried his still, heavy body outside. She buried him on the grassy slope of her own roof, overlooking the entrance, a guardian in death as he had been in life. She fashioned a simple grave marker from a smooth river stone. She did not carve his name. There was no need. Everyone knew who slept there. Her grief was a quiet, deep ocean, but she did not drown in it. Fen had been a good companion. He had seen her through the worst of it. He had seen her vindicated. His work was done. Decades flowed over the valley like slow water. Ilara grew old. Her back, once strained by digging, was now bent with age. Her hands, once calloused from labor, were now wrinkled and deft at mending nets and teaching children to read from her father's books. She lived her life in the quiet rhythm of the seasons, a respected elder in the community she had saved. She watched the children she had taught grow up and have children of their own, all of them born into a world of security she had single-handedly carved from the earth. She died in her sleep one winter night, at the age of 78, in the same sleeping platform she had built as a desperate, exiled child. She was warm, she was safe, and she was not alone. The entire village mourned her as their founder, their savior, their mother. They buried her next to Fen, on the green roof of her shelter. They did not want a grand monument in the center of town. Her monument was the town itself, every warm and sturdy home. But they did place a stone, larger than Fen's, carved by the grandson of Bren the woodcutter. The boy's father, saved as a child in the shelter, had insisted on the words. They were simple, taken from her first defiant conversation in the Barrens, words that had become legend. The epitaph read, "Ilara, she dug a home for us all." A century later, the town was still there. a collection of green, living hills nestled in the valley. The original shelter had been preserved, a sacred site. The entrance was reinforced with stone, the interior kept just as Alara had left it. It was a monument not to a person, but to an idea. That wisdom is sometimes quiet, that truth can be found in the earth, and that the courage of a single, stubborn child can remake the world. On a bright summer day, a young girl with dark hair sat on the grassy mound where Alara and Finn were buried, tracing the carved letters on the stone with her finger. "What does it mean?" she asked her father, who sat beside her. "Dug a home for us all?" Her father looked out over the thriving village, at the plumes of smoke rising from the green hills, at the children playing in the fields. He put an arm around his daughter. "It means," he said, his voice soft with reverence, "that a long time ago, one person listened to the world instead of the crowd. And that is why we are here. That is why we are safe." The girl looked at the stone, then at the town, and for the first time she began to understand the deep, quiet magic of the ground beneath her feet.